The Palace of Vale stretched across the high cliffs of the Red World. Its walls were carved from black stone that glimmered beneath the light of the twin suns. Towers reached toward the sky like spears, and the great halls echoed with voices of nobles and servants. Yet at the heart of this vast place sat one figure who spoke little and listened less. Queen Vale, ruler of the night-born people, carried herself with an air of unshaken strength. But behind her eyes lingered something far heavier than command. Her throne chamber was never truly empty. Advisors brought news of trade, soldiers delivered reports of patrols, and messengers carried words of treaties and warnings. Still, the queen often let their words pass her by as if she had already lived 1,000 lifetimes and heard it all before. She nodded, gave short orders, and returned to silence. In her empire, partnership was seen as a natural step for every leader, warrior, or scholar. Companions bonded together, sharing strength, trust, and vision. They built families, wove stories, and forged alliances that endured centuries. But Vale stood apart from that rhythm. As ruler, she was unmatched. As a being, she was untouchable. When the festivals came, she stood on her high balcony, watching the celebrations in the city below. Lanterns rose into the night sky like a river of stars. Music drifted up from the streets, where her people danced and sang together. In those moments, the palace around her felt more like a cage than a home. The sound of laughter made her remember what she lacked. The people respected her. They feared her strength and revered her crown. Yet no one dared to step close, not in truth. They whispered to each other that the queen's nature was too dark, too dangerous. They said she was meant to rule alone. And so, year after year, she watched others find partners while her own halls stayed cold. Vale did not rage against this silence. She did not cry out for what she did not have. Instead, she carried her loneliness like a hidden blade, sharp and heavy, but kept beneath her cloak of dignity. She moved through her days with discipline, attending councils, hearing petitions, and delivering justice with a voice that never trembled. Her people believed she was beyond need. Only she knew that each passing century deepened the hollow place within her. One evening, she walked alone through the gardens behind the palace. The air carried the scent of flowering vines, and pools of silver water reflected the rising moons. Few dared to follow her there, for the queen's solitude was a rule unspoken. As she paused near one of the pools, she looked down and saw her reflection. Her face was regal, her eyes bright and unyielding, her form clad in robes woven with silver threads. Yet when she gazed at herself, she saw only distance. The reflection stared back at her like a stranger. The thought returned to her as it often did. Why had fate placed her apart from others? She could remember her youth when she had trained with other heirs, when laughter had come more easily, and when she believed companionship would one day be hers as well. Time had taken those hopes away, and duty had built walls around her heart. Now, she was queen and nothing more. The silence grew heavier that night as she lingered in the garden. A group of guards passed at a distance, their armor glinting in the moonlight. But they did not disturb her. Servants carried torches down the walkways, careful not to draw near. Even here, in the open air of the night, she was alone. She sat upon a stone bench and closed her eyes. The sounds of the city beyond the palace reached her faintly, drums, voices, the hum of life. She thought of the companions she had seen across the years. Generals with their loyal partners who fought at their side. Scholars with companions who shared their studies and discoveries. Farmers with families who laughed as they worked the land together. Every bond was a thread in the great tapestry of her empire. Every thread but hers. Vale did not fear battle. She did not fear death. Yet she feared the weight of endless solitude. It was not a fear she spoke of to anyone, not even to herself in full words. But it lived in her heart like a shadow that would not leave. When dawn came, she returned to her throne. She greeted the day as always, cloaked in strength, crowned in authority. Messengers bowed low, lords gave their reports, and servants lit the great torches that filled the hall with light. She sat tall and answered with clarity. No one guessed that behind the steady voice of their queen was a silence she could not break. That morning, One of her advisors, a man named Raoul, hesitated before speaking. He was old and loyal, one of the few who had served her for many decades. His eyes held concern as he looked upon her. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the people rejoice in the bonds they form. They see in their queen one who stands above them all. Yet sometimes I wonder if they also wish to see her share in what they treasure." Vale turned her gaze upon him, sharp as the edge of a blade. "You speak of matters that are not your concern," she answered. Raoul bowed his head. "Forgive me, my queen. It is only that the people love you, and love, even from afar, hopes for more." His words lingered long after he left. Vale did not show her thoughts, but inside she felt a tremor. She had grown used to the idea that none dared think of her as anything but untouchable. To know that even her people wished to see her heart filled unsettled her. When the hall grew empty once more, she rose from her throne and stepped onto the balcony. The city stretched wide below, alive with motion. She could hear faint echoes of children at play, the shouts of merchants, the call of travelers from beyond the stars. She wondered what it would feel like to stand among them, not as a queen, but simply as one among many. The thought was dangerous, perhaps even foolish. Yet it did not leave her. She had ruled for centuries without falter, and still the silence grew heavier each passing year. What was power, she wondered, if it left her with nothing but an empty throne and a reflection she could not recognize? That night, she lay awake in her high chamber. The stars outside her window shimmered like endless lanterns in the sky. Somewhere beyond those stars, she knew, other worlds thrived. Other beings laughed, struggled, and lived. Perhaps on one of those worlds was an answer to the silence that haunted her. She did not yet know that fate was already in motion, and that change would come not from her people, but from a visitor unlike any she had ever met. The day began like any other for Queen Vale. She sat on her throne. High above the polished black floor of the great hall, sunlight poured in through the tall windows, shining across the silver banners that hung on the walls. The palace guards stood silent. Their spears crossed at the doors. Servants moved quickly and carefully, their eyes lowered as they set scrolls on the long tables. But this day carried something unusual. Word had come of a visitor, not from her own people, not from her allies across the stars, but from Earth, a young world that was only beginning to step beyond its skies. Few humans had ever walked within the empire, and fewer still had ever stood before the queen. The sound of boots echoed in the hall as the visitor entered. He was not dressed like the nobles of her world. His clothing was simple, made for travel, not for display. His name was Tomas, and though his steps were steady, it was clear to all that he was aware of the power in the room. Yet he did not bow too deeply, and he did not tremble. He placed one hand across his chest in respect, then raised his head to meet her eyes. "Queen Vale," he said in a firm voice, "I bring greetings from Earth and from those who wish peace with your people." The hall went still. Advisors whispered among themselves. Surprised at his boldness, most envoys spoke with elaborate praise, fearing every glance of the queen. But this human spoke as though she were someone to be greeted, not feared. Vale studied him carefully. His heart beat fast, yet his eyes did not look away. His voice had no false sweetness, no practiced flattery. She leaned forward slightly, her silver crown catching the light. "Peace," she said, her voice calm and deep. "That is a word carried easily, but it is heavy to hold. Why does your Earth seek peace with me?" Tomas stepped closer, though the guards stiffened. He spoke with simple honesty, because strength should not always bring fear. Sometimes strength can bring trust. Earth is small, and your empire is vast. But even small worlds can give friendship if they are heard. Her advisors frowned. To them, such words sounded naive, even arrogant. But Vale listened. There was something in his voice that was not weakness and not pride. It was steady, like the ground beneath one's feet. "You speak boldly," she said. "Do you not fear standing before me?" "I do," Tomas admitted. "But fear does not mean I must kneel in silence. It means I must speak with care and truth. That is the respect I can give." The hall remained quiet, even the whispers of her advisors faded. For the first time in many years, Vale felt something stir in her. Not offense, not anger, but curiosity. She lifted her hand, and the guards eased their stance. "You may remain in my court as guest and envoy. We will hear what Earth offers and what it seeks." Tomas bowed his head once more, then stepped back. His eyes, however, did not lower. They stayed on hers for a brief moment longer than any other had dared. It was not challenge. It was not defiance. It was something else entirely. That evening, the queen dined in her private chamber. The long table was filled with silver dishes and crystal cups. But she ate little. Her thoughts returned again and again to the human's voice. She had heard countless envoys before. They had sung praises, made promises, even begged. None had spoken as Tomas had. His words carried no chains. They were simple. Yet they carried weight. The next day, when council matters ended, she summoned him again. He came without hesitation. She expected nervousness. But instead he greeted her with the same calm respect. "You are far from home," she said. "Do you not feel lost among strangers?" "I feel small," he answered, "but not lost. Wherever people speak and listen, there is a path to walk." His words were plain, yet they carried a warmth she had not felt in her hall for centuries. She asked him about his world, and he spoke of oceans that stretched beyond sight, of forests filled with countless voices of life, of cities that rose like mountains of glass and steel. He spoke of hardships to wars, hunger, and struggles that shaped his people, but he did not hide them. He shared them with honesty, as though he wished her to see the truth of Earth and not a mask. In return, she spoke of her empire, its long history, and the strength of her people. But she also told him, in quieter words, of the silence of her throne, the weight of centuries, and the way distance grew between her and those she ruled. Tomas did not flinch at her words. He did not bow lower or turn pale. Instead, he asked a question that no one else had ever dared. "Do you wish it to remain that way?" The chamber seemed to grow colder with his question. Vale stared at him, and for a long moment she gave no reply. No advisor would have spoken so boldly. No subject would have dared. But this human, from a world so small compared to hers, had looked into her silence and spoken to it. At last, she said quietly, "Few would dare to ask me such a thing." "Sometimes a question must be asked," Tomas replied, "if it carries the chance to ease a burden." That night, Vale walked once more in her moonlit garden. The stars shone bright, the pools shimmered with silver light, and the air was calm. Yet her thoughts were not calm. They circled around the human envoy who had spoken without fear, who had looked upon her loneliness and treated it not as a secret to avoid, but as something he could reach toward. She remembered the way he had listened, without judgment, the way his words held both respect and honesty. She wondered if perhaps this small world, Earth, carried something her vast empire had forgotten. For the first time in centuries, the queen felt a change in the silence around her. It was no longer the silence of endless solitude. It was the silence before something new. The days passed quietly in the palace. Tomas remained as guest and envoy, but his role was no longer only political. Queen Vale found herself calling for him often, at times when official matters had already ended. She would summon him to speak in the gardens, in the quiet study lined with old books, or in the open halls where the sound of footsteps echoed against stone. At first, her advisors did not understand. They whispered among themselves, wondering why their queen, who had for centuries kept distance from all, now sought the company of a single human. But Vale paid no attention to their whispers. She was queen, and her will was final. If she chose to speak with Tomas, then none could forbid it for Tomas. Each meeting with Vale was both a challenge and an honor. He knew her people saw her as untouchable. Yet when he stood near her, he did not feel only fear. He saw the strength in her eyes, yes, but also the weight she carried, the quiet shadow that never left her. And so he spoke with honesty, never hiding behind flattery, never treating her as a figure of myth. To him, she was a person, and he showed her respect in the way he believed respect was meant to be shown through truth. One evening, Vale asked him to walk with her through the high gardens that clung to the cliffs. The moons hung low, casting pale light across the flowers and fountains. The air was cool, and the sound of the sea far below reached their ears in a soft roar. Guards followed at a distance, but stayed far enough not to disturb their voices. Vale's steps were slow, and Tomas matched her pace. For a time, neither spoke. She let the silence stretch, testing him perhaps, waiting to see if he would rush to fill the quiet. He did not. He walked beside her, his presence steady, his gaze moving over the gardens as though he admired them honestly. At last, she said, "Many who stand beside me grow uneasy. Even in silence, they cannot bear it. But you seem at ease." Tomas looked at her calmly. "Silence does not frighten me. Sometimes silence is where truth rests." She turned her head slightly toward him. His words were simple, yet they struck her. For centuries, her silence had been heavy, feared, and avoided. But here was someone who treated it not as a threat, but as something natural. They came to a fountain where water spilled from the carved mouth of a beast into a wide pool. Vale paused, her reflection shivering on the water's surface. She spoke softly, more to herself than to him. "I have walked these gardens for longer than your people have known the stars. Yet I have never shared this path with another." Tomas did not answer with praise or awe. He did not speak of how great or tragic that was. Instead, he asked, "Do you wish to share it now?" Her eyes lifted to his. For a moment, she did not know how to answer. She had always ruled through power, and her life had been measured in commands, treaties, and victories. But this was not a matter of rule. It was a question meant only for her heart. "I do not know," she admitted. They continued their walk until they reached the end of the garden, where the cliff dropped away to the sea. The moons reflected on the water below, to pale circles shimmering on the waves. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of salt and flowers. It was then Tomas did something no one else had ever dared. He extended his hand toward her. It was not a command, not a demand, not even a request spoken aloud. It was simply an offering, a gesture so small it could have been overlooked. Yet to Vale, it was greater than any gift of gold or jewel. She froze. Her eyes locked on his hand, steady and open. Touch, for her, had always been a sign of dominance, of power taken or given, of fear pressed into the skin of another. Never had it been offered like this, with trust and without fear. Her heart, steady through countless battles, gave a single quick beat that unsettled her. She lifted her eyes to Tomas. His face was calm, patient. There was no fear in him, only quiet trust. He would not force her hand, nor withdraw it. The choice was hers alone. Slowly, she raised her hand. Her fingers hovered above his, uncertain, trembling in a way they had not for centuries. Then, at last, she let her hand rest in his. The contact was gentle. His hand was warm, his grip neither weak nor tight. It was steady, grounding. For Vale, who had lived in silence so long, the touch carried a weight that nearly broke through her mask of calm. She felt the strength of his trust, the honesty in his offering. She did not pull away. Instead, she let the moment linger. The sound of the sea filled the silence, and for once, the silence was not heavy. It was not the silence of loneliness, but of peace. Tomas spoke at last, his voice low. "You are not alone, if you choose not to be." The words were simple, yet they struck her deeper than any speech of loyalty or promise of alliance. She had been told for centuries that she was apart, untouchable, destined to rule without a companion. But here, a human from a distant world had spoken as if the choice belonged to her, not to fate. When at last she withdrew her hand, she did so gently. She turned her gaze back to the sea. Her expression remained calm, but within her, something had shifted. A crack had formed in the walls she had built round her heart. As they returned to the palace, the guards glanced at her, then at Tomas. They saw nothing unusual, for the gesture had been small and private. But within the queen, the change was immense. For the first time in countless years, she felt not only the weight of command but also the spark of connection. That night, when she lay in her chamber, she thought not of treaties or enemies. She thought of a single human hand, steady and warm, reaching toward her without fear. and she thought of how she had reached back. The palace had never felt the same since Tomas arrived. Even in the grand halls where silence had ruled for centuries, there was now a subtle change. It was not loud or obvious, but those who served the queen noticed a small shift in the air. Vale, once distant and untouchable, now spent long hours walking the gardens or the corridors with a human beside her. She asked questions, listened, and sometimes allowed herself to laugh quietly at stories he told. Tomas, for his part, understood the delicacy of the bond they were forming. He did not seek to control or impress the queen. He shared simple truths about his life on Earth, the bright mornings, when the sun shone over his small village, the evenings spent near rivers watching stars, and the quiet moments when he felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him. He spoke of humans as they truly were flawed, but capable of courage and hope. Vale listened. She had spent centuries surrounded by people who obeyed her, who feared her, who flattered her for gain. Yet in Tomas' presence, she felt something she had not known before, understanding. He did not seek to serve her as a queen. He sought only to see her as a person. And she began, slowly, to do the same with him. Their walks in the gardens became daily rituals. Sometimes they spoke in whispers as the twin moons rose, casting long shadows across the flowering paths. Other times, they walked in silence, content in each other's company. Vale noticed small things about Tomas that she had never noticed about anyone else. The way he tilted his head when thinking, the way his eyes brightened at stories of Earth's rivers and forests, and the quiet patience with which he listened to her speak. One afternoon, Vale invited Tomas to the library, a vast chamber filled with books and scrolls collected over countless generations. Dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through the windows. Here, she showed him texts few others had ever read. She explained the history of her people, the battles they had fought, and the wisdom they had gained. Tomas did not speak immediately. He walked slowly among the shelves, touching the spines of the books with reverence. Then he looked at Vale and said, "All of this is incredible, but it must have weighed on you as well." Vale raised an eyebrow. Few had dared to speak of her burdens. She said nothing at first, watching him as he spoke. "It has," she admitted. "Centuries of rule leave marks deeper than the scars of battle. I have carried them alone for too long." Tomas stepped closer. "Then perhaps it is time to share them," he said softly. "Not because you must, but because someone chooses to listen." That simple idea struck her harder than she expected. For centuries, she had ruled through command and solitude. The thought of sharing her burdens, not as a sign of weakness, but as an act of trust, was new. And yet, with Tomas, it did not frighten her. Days turned into weeks. The bond between them grew stronger, though it remained careful and respectful. Vale began to anticipate his presence, and Tomas found himself learning more of her world than any other visitor had. He observed her decision-making, her strategy in ruling, and her sense of justice. He admired her not just as a queen, but as a leader who carried the weight of her people with unwavering determination. Vale, too, found herself changing. The laughter she had hidden returned slowly, first in the form of quiet smiles, then in soft amusement at Tomas' stories. She began to speak of things she had never spoken aloud, memories of her youth, dreams she had abandoned, and the loneliness that had defined her life. Each revelation was met with patience, not judgment. One evening, Vale invited Tomas to the highest balcony of the palace. Below, the city sprawled, lights twinkling like scattered stars. The air was filled with the distant hum of life, and the twin moons cast silver paths across the horizon. "You see this," she said quietly, "and you feel how vast it is. Yet it feels smaller now than it did before." Tomas looked at her, curious. "Why smaller?" "Because with you here, I feel connected. The world does not seem so endless, and I do not feel so alone." Tomas placed a hand gently on the railing beside hers, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, but careful not to overstep. "I am glad," he said simply, "because no one should bear everything alone." That moment, brief and unassuming, held more meaning than any formal ceremony or declaration of loyalty. Vale realized that she had begun to trust him completely, and in that trust, she felt her power deepen rather than weaken. Strength, she learned, was not only in solitude but in connection. Their bond became known quietly throughout the palace. Servants spoke in hushed tones of the queen's unusual companionship. Advisors watched, curious and cautious, as the queen appeared lighter, more approachable, yet still commanding as ever. Some questioned whether this bond might weaken her rule. Others began to wonder if it might strengthen her in ways they could not yet see. It was not long before a test came, though not the kind Vale expected. A rival house, jealous of her power and unsettled by the human visitor, sent messages that hinted at discontent and possible rebellion. They implied that the queen had grown soft, that her focus had shifted away from the strength of the empire. Vale read the messages in her private chamber, with Tomas nearby. She did not show fear or anger. Instead, she folded the scrolls carefully and looked at him. "They believe my bond with you makes me weaker," she said. Tomas shook his head. "No, it does not. Strength comes not only from power and skill, but also from trust and understanding. You have both." Vale allowed herself a small smile. "It seems you understand my people more than many of my own advisors." He smiled back. "Perhaps I see what others do not, that even the strongest need someone to walk beside them." Weeks passed, and the bond between them continued to grow. Vale began to share her strategy openly, asking Tomas for advice not as a king would to a subject, but as a partner would to a companion. He offered insight, not commands, and she weighed his thoughts alongside her own. Together, they found solutions that neither could have reached alone. In quiet moments, they shared simple pleasures. They watched the moons rise, drank warm tea in the palace gardens, and sometimes simply sat in silence. Vale began to notice small details about Tomas that brought unexpected joy. The way he laughed softly at small jokes, the care with which he treated the palace animals, the way he listened without impatience for the first time in centuries. Vale did not feel the weight of immortality pressing her down. The silence that had once haunted her became a companionable quiet, a space where the beings could exist together without words, without fear, and without obligation. One afternoon, as they walked through the gardens, Tomas paused beside a pool of water. He knelt, placing his hand gently on the surface. The reflection of the twin moons shimmered and danced across the water. He looked up at Vale. "You see how it moves and changes," he said. "Even stillness is not permanent. Life flows, and it carries change with it." Vale considered his words carefully. She had ruled through centuries of stillness, through expectation and duty. Yet she realized now that life was not only about endurance, but also about moments of connection. Trust and companionship did not weaken her. They made her stronger. She placed her hand gently over his, letting him feel the warmth of her presence. "Then perhaps it is time to embrace that change," she said. Tomas looked at her, his eyes bright with understanding and care. "I will walk beside you," he said. "Not as your subject, not as your servant, but as someone who chooses to be with you." Vale's chest lifted slightly, as though a weight had been removed. She smiled, and the smile reached her eyes for the first time in centuries. For the first time, she felt not only strength, but also hope. She had found someone who did not fear her, who did not seek to control her, and who respected both her power and her heart. The bond between the queen and the human had grown beyond mere companionship. It became a partnership built on trust, respect, and understanding. Together, they began to shape a future where strength was not measured by fear alone, but by the courage to connect, to trust, and to share burdens. And though the empire watched and whispered, Vale knew one truth more certain than any crown or army: she was no longer alone. And the bond they shared would carry them both through whatever challenges lay ahead. The palace stirred early that morning. The twin suns had barely risen, yet the air was already filled with tension. Word had reached Queen Vale that rival houses were gathering in secret, whispering doubts about her rule. They saw her bond with the human, Tomas, as a weakness. Some dared to say that the queen's judgment had been clouded by affection. that her empire might crumble if she allowed a foreigner to stand beside her. Vale stood on her balcony overlooking the city. The light of the dawn reflected on the black towers of her palace, casting long shadows. She watched the streets below, where her people went about their day, unaware of the brewing unrest. For centuries, she had ruled with an iron will. She had faced rebellion, betrayal, and countless battles. Yet never had she faced a challenge quite like this. Beside her, Tomas stood quietly. He did not speak, did not gesture. He simply waited, his presence steady, as if to remind her that she was not alone. Vale did not need words. She felt his trust as clearly as she felt the wind across the balcony. "Do you fear them?" Tomas asked softly. Vale turned to him. Her eyes were clear, steady, and full of thought. "Fear is not what I feel," she said. "They doubt me. They doubt the bond I have chosen. That is a different kind of test." Tomas nodded. "Then meet their doubts as you always have, with strength. But remember, strength alone is not always power. Trust, honesty, and connection, they are just as strong, sometimes stronger." She considered his words. In the past, she might have ignored this challenge, met it with force or threats, and ended the matter quickly. But something had changed. The human had shown her another kind of power, the power of partnership. And today, she would wield it. The rival houses gathered in the great hall, their banners unfurled, their expressions a mix of fear and arrogance. They had expected the queen to meet their challenge alone, to rule through intimidation and command. Yet Vale entered the hall with Tomas at her side. The guards bowed, the banners swayed, and the room fell silent. For a moment, none dared speak. Then one of the elder lords stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "your alliance with a human is troubling. Some believe it weakens your judgment and dishonors the traditions of our people." Vale's gaze was sharp. She had faced far greater threats than whispered criticism. Yet she knew that this moment was not merely about words. It was about proving that she could lead without fear, and that connection did not diminish power. "Tradition," she said slowly, "is important. But tradition alone does not define strength. Strength is in action, in wisdom, and in the courage to choose trust over fear. Tomas stands with me not because I command it, not because he must obey, but because he chooses to. That is far stronger than mere fear." The hall murmured, some in shock, some in hesitation. Vale continued, her voice unwavering. "I have ruled for centuries, and I have carried the weight of this empire alone. But today, I show you that a ruler can choose partnership without losing authority. Tomas is my companion, and his presence strengthens me. Let that be clear to all who doubt." Tomas stepped forward, though he kept his posture humble. "I am not here to lead," he said. "I am here to walk beside the queen, to support her, and to learn from her. Her strength does not diminish in connection. It grows." Vale allowed a small smile to touch her face. The room remained silent, the rival houses staring in disbelief. No one had ever spoken in this way within the palace walls. No one had ever dared to defend the queen not from fear, but from choice and trust. The elder lords shifted uncomfortably. Some realized the truth in her words. Strength was not only in solitude and power. It could also be found in connection, in the courage to allow another to stand beside you. The murmurs quieted as the message sank in. Vale turned her gaze to the city beyond the hall's windows. She thought of her people, of the countless lives she had protected, and of the endless years she had carried alone. She understood that leadership was not only about fear or obedience. It was about vision, wisdom, and the ability to embrace change when necessary. She raised her voice, and every corner of the hall listened. "I will not let fear of tradition or doubt of outsiders dictate my rule. I choose to lead with strength and with trust. Those who walk with me, those who support me, are part of that strength, and those who seek to challenge it must first face the unity and resolve of my people." A silence fell again, longer this time. It was not filled with tension, but with understanding. The rival houses had expected a queen who ruled alone. They had expected fear, and instead they saw clarity, confidence, and an unexpected bond that neither could diminish. Outside, the city continued to wake. News traveled quickly, and soon citizens whispered to one another about the queen and her companion. For the first time, many saw that connection did not weaken a ruler. It strengthened the empire, inspiring loyalty and respect in those who had never dared to question her strength. Vale and Tomas walked together after the council, returning to the gardens where they had shared their first moments of quiet together. The twin moons had not yet risen, but the light of the day felt warmer somehow, as if the world itself had shifted. "You handled them well," Tomas said. "They will remember this day." Vale shook her head slightly. "It was not just me. You were here. You reminded me that strength is more than power. It is courage, connection, and choice." "That is what they witnessed." Tomas smiled. "Then we witnessed it together." She looked at him, truly looked, and saw not only his presence but the trust and care he carried. In that moment, she understood fully that she had chosen correctly. The centuries of solitude had not been her fate. Her choice to reach out, to allow another to walk beside her, had changed everything. Later that night, she stood alone for a moment on her balcony, gazing at the twin moons above the horizon. The stars shimmered, and the city lights reflected like scattered diamonds. She thought of all the years she had ruled in silence and how that silence had shaped her. Yet she no longer feared the quiet. The quiet had become a space where trust could grow, where companionship could flourish, and where she could finally embrace what she had long denied herself. Tomas joined her, standing silently at her side. She did not speak immediately, for words were unnecessary. Instead, she allowed him to stand beside her, feeling the warmth of his presence, the steady heartbeat of someone who had chosen to be there. Finally, she spoke. "I have lived centuries believing that I must stand alone, that no one could understand or share the weight of my life. But I see now that was not true. Strength is not in solitude. Strength is in the courage to allow trust, to allow connection, and to accept partnership." Tomas nodded. "And you have shown that even the greatest can choose to be more than what is expected. That is real strength." Vale placed her hand lightly on his. This small gesture, so simple and yet so profound, sealed the bond they had formed. It was not merely trust. It was mutual understanding, respect, and the choice to face the future together. The empire had witnessed it, the rival houses had learned it, and the citizens would speak of it for generations. A queen who could rule with power, wisdom, and partnership had emerged stronger than ever. In the quiet of the balcony, under the glow of the twin moons, Vale allowed herself a rare and genuine smile. She had faced solitude and fear for centuries, yet she had discovered that even the mightiest could reach out, and in doing so, find strength beyond what they had imagined. The empire would endure, the people would thrive, and the queen, who had once believed she must stand alone, would never be alone again. For Vale and Tomas, the future was not defined by power alone, but by choice, trust, and the courage to walk together. And in that choice lay the truest form of strength.